if you were to give us a portrayal of what would be considered a classic experience slash experiencer, a
Okay.
conscious someone who is conscious of their experiences, what would that sketch look like to you? About 2 minutes.
Well, okay. People who are conscious that something very unusual happened and was probably an extraterrestrial encounter, what they tend to experience is that suddenly, when they are asleep in bed at night, they will wake up and be aware that either there's a bright light coming in through the window, like a beam of light spreading out, or very bright light outside the window that doesn't make any sense that there would be bright light outside the window. And then they may be aware that there are sparkles of light coming into the room and circling around, or they may wake up and suddenly see other beings who are not human in the room. They might see somebody coming out of the closet, or coming in through the bedroom door, or coming in through the bedroom window, or just simply already being there when the person wakes up. And very typically, the person realizes that he cannot move and he cannot call out to somebody else who might be in the room. He might have somebody sleeping in the bed with him, but that person seems to be so deeply asleep that they cannot be awakened, that cannot be roused, that there are other beings there. And then the person usually doesn't remember too much more consciously, but in some cases they're aware of being levitated up over the bed and floating through the wall or the ceiling or the closed window and out into space. And usually that's all they remember. Or another thing that typically happens is that a person might be driving along in a car with or without another passenger, and they are aware that there's something overhead or maybe in back of the car up above, and a beam, often a beam of light, will be shining down through the car. And they wonder about that, of course. And then the car motor will start petering out and come to a stop, and giving the person enough time to pull off the road and be in a safe location. Um, and then, if they remember more than that consciously, they remember that the light seems to surround the car and fill the car, and that there are unusual beings standing outside the car and getting into the car, taking them out. That's usually as much as somebody consciously remembers. Or the experiencer could be in a very public place, like a big office setting, and suddenly that person goes out of conscious awareness when beings come into that office, and everybody else in the office is suddenly out of conscious awareness. We call that being switched off. Now, people can also be taken for one of these encounters when they're walking along a beach or walking along the sidewalk or out in a field or in the woods. It can happen just about anywhere, but typically they will remember only those first several moments at the beginning of the experience.
Okay. All
And
right.
that's hypnotic regression to the experience they remember that little bit of can be so very helpful in filling in all the details, reliving that whole encounter from the beginning to the end. Many people have not seen beings or had the unusual beginning that I have just mentioned. But many people will wake up in the morning and notice that there's an unusual marking on their body. It might be a scoop-shaped mark somewhere on an arm or a leg or elsewhere. It might be two little pinprick marks. It might be a perfect circle of pinprick marks. It might be a triangle of pinprick marks somewhere, and even markings that whoever is living with them will notice on their back. And they think, how could I possibly have done that? And then very typically for women especially, there could be a triangle bruise mark on the navel or right near the navel. So when people weigh, oh yeah, and straight line cuts I've seen, and little fingertip looking bruises. So people notice these and think, how could I have done that? I couldn't have done that. Something must have gone on. And when a person has that sort of thing happen over a period of years and are wondering more and more, how on earth did that happen? And then particularly if then they begin to hear that there is such a thing as being visited by extraterrestrials, then very often they want to look into it. And yes, definitely fears and phobias with certain people are a clue that they might have had extraterrestrial encounters. Like one woman I worked with was afraid of big, shiny floors. And so whenever she went into a hospital to visit somebody or for her own need, she was really spooked out by the big, open, shiny floors. It turned out after we did some regressions that that was the kind of floor that she would see on the spaceship when she was taken for an encounter. Another woman, well, several people I've worked with have had a tremendous fear of needles, like hypodermic needles and blood. And it turns out that in the regressions, they did have injections given to them. And it was all in this mysterious setting that they don't consciously remember, but they do remember having that fear of needles or a bit of blood. And those are just some typical examples. Another important clue that people have that maybe they've had experiences is that they will have a very close sighting of a UFO. A sighting that's not just a little light up in the sky, but with one that can actually see the shape of the craft, and it might come very close to the person. In many cases, it'll come right over the roof of their house. And in other words, it will be very clear and distinct and make a really remarkable impression on the person. Now, many people I've worked with did not know that when they had a close sighting like that, they actually had a personal encounter. In other words, they were made to be not conscious of that. But whenever I hear of a really close, vivid sighting like that, I have to wonder, because so many people have gone on to have the encounter without realizing. Another thing that is very important is the issue of a person having missing time. Yeah, many people have no other clue that they've been having these encounters, but they do recall vividly one time, often when they're driving, but it could happen anywhere, and that suddenly it's 2 or 3 hours, well, 1 to 2 hours later than it should be, and they just have no recollection of where that time went.
There's a phenomenon known that's even more common than what's called missing time, as highway hypnosis or road hypnosis, or sometimes it's referred to as white line, like the highway white lines
Yes.
fever. This is a
Right.
phenomenon that many of us have experienced, in which it
Oh,
seems
yeah.
conscious awareness goes elsewhere. You continue driving, and there's another phenomenon known as it's sort of a brain autopilot that will take you 99% of the time without harm to that destination. So you come
Right.
back into awareness and realize, how did I get here? Well, I got the thought, I wonder if there is any way we could make a correlation of the more traditional missing time anomalies and this sort of highway hypnosis. If the consciousness is leaving, focused elsewhere, particularly for a period of time, how might we know or not know that consciousness for that period of time is interacting with another form of intelligence? So I'm actually drawing a nexus between the classic missing time examples and this highway hypnosis. What are your thoughts on that possibility?
Well, the highway hypnosis is a very, very common state that we all experience many, many times. It's called the alpha state,
That's right.
brainwave activity. And it's the same state that we're in when we're very involved in reading a book. And we might be aware somebody else came in the room or the radio is on or something, but we're mostly absorbed in reading whatever we're reading in the book. It's the same state that we're in every night when we're falling asleep, and every morning when we're waking up, and when we're sitting in a movie and we're so absorbed in the movie, and yet there may be somebody coming and sitting next to us or eating popcorn or something, and yet we're slightly aware of that, but mostly absorbed in what we're watching. So that's a very, very typical state. But in the missing time experience, the person does not have the sense of functioning, like driving on the road, for instance. It's just that whole period of time is just gone completely from their recollection.
But my question is, could we possibly, as a stretch even, count this? Let's speak specifically, and I'm obviously familiar with the alpha state as sort of this somewhat altered state before we get into the deeper levels of being, having this highway hypnosis, finding yourself at a location. Consciousness is focused elsewhere, so you do not have conscious recollection of going through a traffic light or taking that left-hand turn or leaving that exit. Could we possibly count that as, in some cases, instances of contact when that consciousness is elsewhere and autopilot is taking you? It's not a classic missing time. That's the question I'm asking you.
Yes, well, there are some cases where somebody is driving along and without understanding why, they find themselves turning off the highway and making a right turn and a left turn and ending up at a certain place without having consciously intended to do so. And those cases I'm referring to happen to be cases where the person was taken for an encounter after they got to that place off the highway.
If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to watch what's next, plus more to explore. And don't forget to subscribe to Higher Journeys.